You are listening to the audio edition of Unstoppable Farce, the Mitch Maloney story, by Mitch Maloney, read by the author.
Chapter 16. The Descendants of the Deplatformed. If you've never been dragged through a damp and putrid tunnel in a net made out of vines by a pack of human-ape hybrids, consider yourself lucky. It's not as much fun as it sounds. There's maybe a dozen of them, these evolutionary loose ends. They're between 3 and 4 feet tall, arms twice as long as the legs, covered with a reddish-orange shag carpeting, big yellow incisors, and dark little nervous eyes. Pretty much exactly the way the local tribesman described the goo-goo. And if that wasn't enough to convince me they were in fact the legendarily reclusive and mysterious creatures, they also keep muttering goo-goo to each other, repeatedly, as if they're having a whole conversation in a language with only one sound. Goo 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 goo, says goo goo number 1. Goo 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 goo, says goo goo 2. One thing the tribesmen didn't mention were the cumbersome and unwieldy sorry about that. Bazooms. And I'm not talking about the silicone cantaloupes you see all over Lipstick City. I'm talking long and pendulous knockers. Maybe the droopiest chi-chis I've ever seen. And I've shared a green room with Jim Gaffigan. They drag me through an opening into a larger, hollowed-out chamber, dimly illuminated by hanging lanterns. I stare up at the supporting planks forming wishbone-shaped arches, like I'm inside a giant spinal column. Between the lingering wooziness of my traumatic head injuries and the lack of natural light, there's no telling how long I've been getting dragged around down here. But apparently the demi-yetis are getting tuckered out themselves. They hoist the net up on a large industrial hook hanging from a moldering scaffold, and then, one by one, in rapid succession, they collapse together in one big fuzzy pile, rising and falling together in a group snooze. And they're not what you'd call light sleepers either. Their collective raspy whistling snore pretty much guarantees that I won't be catching any shut-eye of my own anytime soon. But at least my noggin isn't getting knocked around on the rocky cave floor for the time being. My eyes start to adjust to the dim brown-orange lantern light, and a little farther down the chamber, moving in the shadows, I see someone, or something, dragging itself over towards me. This poor wretch has been stuck in this cave for the devil knows how long, and he's so severely demonetized, and so hideously deplatformed, that he's barely recognizable. And when I say deplatformed, I mean deplatformed. He's missing both of his legs, and from what I can tell, most, if not all, of his shtick and bits. It's getting closer, waddling laboriously on its long, claw-like hands, draped in scraps of mesh and lace, a shadowy boogeyman, with a pale, fearsome face, like Australasian cinema's beloved nightmare creature, the Booby Duke, but scruffier, greasier, and with a crazed expression that could only be described as maniacally frisky. The elaborately trellised, high-rise, matted bouffant hairdo, undulating and wobbling independently of its half-human host below, verifies the identity of the legendarily lascivious chuckle dealer, the only punchline peddler I can think of who's on the record for letting rodents habitate his hairdo.
Endnote 1.
I know this creature, this sleazy seducer, this rabidly randy rapscallion. I've seen this face on the cover of Narcissist Festival magazine and near the top of Sliding Rock's list of 50 most disgraced famous comedians. But for the life of me, I can't think of his name. It was something like Trussell Strand, Crussell Bland, Brussels Gland? So far, he hasn't made a noise. Maybe he's gone feral. Maybe he's lost the ability to speak. Maybe I'll be spared the nasal staccato jumble of Dickensian Cockney and hyper-verbose pseudo-intellectualisms that were once the trademark of the now disgraced hot-take hawker. But no such luck. I see the lights go on behind his eyes as he realizes he has an audience.
Hello, hello, you disheveled discoverer. Welcome to this shadowy abyss, this subterranean habitat for cryptozoological anomalies and periodic port of protection for humiliated humorists, the comedians of ill repute.
There must be some mistake. I'm not a comedian of ill repute. I'm just laying low for a little while on the advice of my crisis management team.
Of course you is. It's the same story for me, brother. Everybody who comes here is merely a pawn in the machinations of the techno-globalist overlords of the pharma entertainment industrial complex. We didn't do nothing to deserve it.
Okay then. I'm glad we're on the same page, because frankly, I've got better things to do than summarize previous chapters. And besides, like my agent Gabby Gersh always says, why should I implicate myself in a potential court-martial at The Hague? I'll tell you what, Trunken Dressel. How's about you start by liberating me from the oppression of this here net with that little sword you've got hanging from your neck? And when that's all settled, I'll be happy to help you unmask this evil conspiracy or whatever. Of course, I have no intention of joining forces with Gristle Flan, but the way I figure it, when the time for double crossing eventually arrives, he shouldn't be too hard to outrun. The lascivious, limb-limited lech takes me up on it. He pulls himself up like a chimp onto the scaffolding and starts sawing against the vines with the serrated inner edge of his scimitar. And so I listen to the truncated troublemaker babble on about the evils of legacy media and the machinations of elite cabals. In case you haven't noticed, his voice is just a little bit different than how it used to be. Probably because a piece of his soul has been broken. Or maybe it's the fact that his gonads have been removed. Now he's going on about the miracle mineral that's supposedly been stripped out of the cavern by Dunsko Extractions International. High-grade magnetite originally intended to be sold as a construction commodity, but then discovered to be infused with sassafras, the active ingredient for a class of psychedelic psychostimulants, to create an alloy found only here, in the underground tunnels formed by the magma of Krakatoa, far below the forest floor of the Batu Ronggring rainforest. This miracle substance / uniquely powerful drug was currently being processed and stockpiled at some secured and unknown location, while the company develops their rollout marketing strategy for the product. It's all nonsense, of course, the ramblings of a demented mind. Somehow the combination of isolation and humiliation had made his narcissistic loquaciousness even less comprehensible than before he was banished from polite society. I ask him what the story is in regards to his lackluster lower body, and he tells me that's the result of AA. I tell him I've heard the road to recovery can be a real bitch. He says he's actually referring to the albino alligators that swim in the toxic fluid that flows through the grotto of the descendants of the Deplatformed. Albino alligators, eh? Sounds pretty nasty. But I guess it still beats a 12-step program. For 100 years, he tells me, The comedians of ill repute have taken refuge in this cave, as well as in the arms and orifices of the apes of the forest. The hereditary shadow of shame and scandal can be read on the faces of the gugu. The nostril shapes and wrinkle patterns indented along the bridge of the nose are not only the best way to distinguish individuals, but also make it possible to connect the various patrilineal lines. The abundant exposition in his dubious diatribe is exhausting. But on the plus side, the hole in the net is now nearly wide enough for me to squeeze through. Suddenly, a spear flies through the musty air and plants itself in his shoulder. He hisses and then plummets to the cave floor, quickly scurrying through the darkness as a gaggle of gugus chases after the wobbling and weaving human torso. I hear his anguished and eternally irritating commentary echoing through the chamber behind me.
The truth that I've been speaking has been corroborated by what you've seen for yourself. The powers that be will stop at nothing to silence.
And then his words fade away in the darkness, buried below a pile of scale model squatches. I manage to slip out of the net and drop to the ground with a thud. I pick up and pocket the curly dagger, and as quickly and quietly as I can, I zip off down the cave in the opposite direction of the hirsute horde, until I see a waft of purple smoke emanating through a crevice between two boulders. I yank the smaller of the moss-covered rocks to one side, exposing a roughly dug-out passage. The overpowering stench of rotting asparagus and cabbage wafts out, not the kind of smell I'd move towards under normal circumstances, but I don't have another option. So I wedge myself through the crevice and emerge in a musty, tubular cavity, like some giant drainage ditch. The cave is damp and dark, illuminated only by the faint purplish glow coming off a gurgling cough syrup-like fluid that forms a smoldering stream that cuts a deep crevice through the center of the cave floor. I hear a creaking noise and turn to see a crudely constructed raft floating towards me. The body of the vessel appears to be a faded safety placard about the size of a billboard, illustrating the proper use of gloves and gas masks, while 4 bobbing black steel drums, coated in mossy sludge, are lashed to each corner for flotation purposes. The captain of the makeshift ship is pretty much what you'd expect. Some kind of second-rate Grim Reaper-style mysterious shrouded figure, slowly and methodically propelling the vessel by dragging a long steel pole along the depths of the noxious canal. Who knows where this boat is headed? But seems like the smart move right now is putting as much distance as possible between me and the spear-tossing halflings. So I take a chance and a running leap. Oh man, I wish I could show it to you. You know what I mean? Because words can't really do it justice, but take it from me, it's one hell of a jump. Way more athletic than you probably think I can jump. I surprise myself, to be honest. Anyway, I land the beautiful soaring leap onto the raft and try to catch my breath, but the putrid stench of toxic sludge radiates around me, so relaxing isn't exactly an option at the moment. As I float down the river Styx, I see a honeycomb of rocky crevasses further up the banks, and within them dozens of puny primates similar to the gugus that had me trapped just a few pages ago. But instead of the calm, focused fuzzballs with oversized droopy bazooms, these ones are flat-chested and have a desperate, particularly pathetic demeanor. I guess toxic masculinity is toxic masculinity, no matter what genetic cul-de-sac you're dealing with. They seem to be engaged in certain behaviors that primatologists might refer to as annoying, goofing off type behaviors, practicing pratfalls and spit takes and silly walks. One of them is tossing up and attempting to catch some twigs and stones, a primordial attempt at juggling, while another one whacks him with a gnarled, flat-edged branch, like some kind of primitive slapstick. "Dear Lord," I exclaim, my voice echoing throughout the cavern. Jussel Clam was right. What kind of a life is it down here for these hideous genetic atrocities? These half-monkey men and half-humiliated yuck-huckster nepo mutants. These evolutionary echoes of the comedians of ill repute. The cloaked raft paddler slowly turns to look at me. A twisted, maniacal smear of cherry-red lipstick crawls up one side of her face. She's no hair-covered cryptid or legless lust junkie, but she's just as freakish in her own way. Underneath the cloak, she's sporting grimy, high-waisted red slacks and a soiled purple cat sweatshirt. An adult woman dressed as a grade schooler that's been living in a showerless poison cave for who knows how long. I've seen this creature in the gossip pages of Voyeuriety magazine and read the takedown hit pieces in the Puffington Roast, although now I can't recall what she did that was so scandalous. No doubt it was something about being a groomer, but judging by her current condition, I sure wouldn't trust her with my cat and a pair of clippers. I know she had a dunce tube series that was a big hit with the middle school set a few years back. What was it again? Millicent Croons? Melissa Warbles? Melisandre in Tones? How far she's fallen since she warned her so-called haters that she was taking over the world, that she was going to be more famouser than Beyoncé, Oprah, and the Taco Bell dog all combined.
Endnote 2.
My heart is full of fear, because the voice she uses as Melanie yodels is sheer decibolic diabolism, even compared to the legless lust puppet from earlier in this chapter. If she starts talking, I'm not sure if my fragile mental state could endure it, let alone recreate it for this audiobook presentation. All I can do is pray that she keeps that garishly smudged mouth of hers shut. But then I get a closer look at her giggle mug, and I'm relieved to see that it's been stapled shut. Sure, it looks painful, but trust me, it's for the best. This way we'll both be spared. But then she does something even worse than talk or sing, something that shakes me to my very core. She pulls out a ukulele and begins to strum. Ukulele, the last refuge of the defeated dunce tuber. As the raft winds deeper down the passage, the cave wall becomes more sheer, but is punctuated by a series of recessed chambers, each containing a separate and distinct cluster of goo-goos. I see a group of 5 or 6 nebbish specimens nervously pacing back and forth. They all have the same bad posture, stooped shoulders and weak chin, and are awkwardly shrugging their shoulders and avoiding eye contact with one another. I remember what Brussels Span told me about how you can keep track of the different groups of goo-goos by zeroing in on the schnozzle. The snoots of these particular monkeys are pretty eggplant-esque, you might say. A couple of them are repeatedly sliding their fingers up the bridge of their beaks, as if pushing back a pair of invisible spectacles. A particularly small, nervous specimen leans back against the cave wall, fiddling with a crudely carved woodwind sort of instrument, while another is scurrying after an oversized lobster-like creature. We come to the next outcropping, where I see another grouping of demi-yetis, these ones with broad, flattened noses and lightly freckled skin visible on their huge, hairless foreheads. Instead of standing up like the other goo-goos I've seen so far, these ones are sitting down on crudely assembled stick stools, wagging their fingers and mumbling in a soothingly rhythmic cadence. Goo 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 goo, like they're telling some long and boring childhood anecdote. I notice several empty Jell-O pudding pop cups littering the cave floor. The next outcropping contains a group of creatures taller and lankier than the others, with a woolly tuft of hair pointing skyward and a hawk-like snoot. Several of them are gathered in a circle, taking turns spastically sliding through a rocky archway, while the others stagger about looking perplexed and gesticulating awkwardly. The sound they're making is harsher, offensive even, and they bark it out on a loop as if they've lost the ability to stop themselves. Goo-goo, 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 goo-goo. The contaminated river takes us around a dark bend and into an inlet that contains yet another pack of petite primates. These ones are schlubbier than the others. Maybe it's the distinctive fringes of creamsicle-colored fur around the domes of their heads, or the way they're pacing back and forth, shrugging and rubbing their foreheads like they're befuddled or exasperated about something. But they remind me of an FC that towered above all the rest in the first decade of the new millennium. A man brave enough to reveal his darkest urges on stage until the hashtag hordes took him down. As someone whose name I can't recall once put it, all icons are a reflection of your perception. They are used like saints or gods, here to tell, to give us warnings of the perils of success.
Endnote 3.
One of the auburn-tufted schlub monkeys seems to take notice of me and scurries down the bank toward the boat, moving his furry hand down south, yanking on his his Rodney, while looking right at me with his little deranged beady yellow eyes. Another one follows suit, and the next thing I know, they're all on the edge of the toxic stream, slapping their beef bolognas right at me. One of them fires off a wad of clam sauce that just misses my shoulder. The others scurry along the shore, keeping pace with the cart while stroking their kalakalas with furious gusto. The next one gets me on the trousers. A third one hits my arm. I'm seriously considering taking my chances with the mystery chemicals in the wastewater below. But then I see a pair of scaly, king-sized alabaster tails ripple through the waves. The albino alligators. Turns out that Streusel Canned was right about a lot of things. Thankfully, the rocky outcropping of this section of cave comes to an end, and the diddling committee gets salami blocked by a spiky fence of stalactites. But the pale gators are circling and snapping, and the way I see it, I can solve two problems with one move. So my sincerest apologies to Mallory Does Karaoke, but I think I'll be finishing this cruise solo. I see the raft is just about to pass underneath the business end of a large drainage tube hanging from the stony darkness above, dripping the glowing purple liquid into the toxic stream. The hooting of the slap-happy simians has faded away, and the cave is almost silent. Just the creaking of the decrepit raft floating in the effluence, and the intermittent dripping of liquid. But there's another sound. A noise echoing down through the crusty orifice. A low moaning in a familiar timbre with, if I'm not mistaken, a distinctly Swedish inflection, and even an affable tinge. It is Leif, my affable Swedish chauffeur, the one I've been searching for this whole chapter in case I forgot to mention it. As I pass underneath, I grab hold of the corrugated rim and yank myself up into the slimy, gaseous tube. It's disgusting and slippery as hell, but I'm determined to follow that moan to its source, because Leif is more than just an excellent driver who safely escorted me through treacherous terrain in every corner of the globe. He's also my friend, and perhaps more importantly, he often does catering for me on the side, and prepares a truly outstanding smorgasbord, and I'm not about to let that go.
This audio edition of Unstoppable Farce, the Mitch Maloney story, was made possible by the Seventh Reformed Church of Latter-day Witnesses, the Bleepers.